Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier list and guide, where we are continuing our series on all the consumables in Baldur's Gate 3. Today, we're covering grenades. We've already covered drugging ourselves with potions and with elixirs, and so let's talk about drugging and or exploding our enemies, which is a very important tool in your arsenal. While these grenades will come up, I would say, less frequently than potions or elixirs, they're still very valuable, especially for the early game, which is the most difficult point in the game for almost every party. And so having a good knowledge of what these grenades do, when to use them, and how to gain the most benefit out of them will definitely help improve your play. They're useful for a number of reasons. They can give ranged attacks to characters that don't otherwise have them. They can stun enemies or prevent them from moving, or create surface effects, which can be very valuable for various characters. They have a lot of different effects that you can apply, many of which duplicate spells without having to actually spend the spell slot, and they only take an attack action to throw. It doesn't take your full action, so you can throw multiple of them if you have multiple attacks on your turn. In particular, this is very valuable for the Berserker Barbarian, because they can throw a grenade with their bonus action throw, do additional damage, and knock an enemy prone with a direct hit with it, while getting the effects of the grenade. So it's a very powerful tool in the arsenal of that character in particular, but every character can benefit from this a lot. Spellcasters especially can benefit from having some grenades equipped in the early game, because often they won't have a good default offensive action to take on their turn, and having a grenade can really help you over the top, and the ability to do just guaranteed AoE damage without spending a resource can help you take out a couple low health enemies guaranteed without having to spend a spell slot on it. Normally in the early game that would require a spell to do AoE damage. Grenades get around that problem very well. There's also a number with extremely powerful effects that will remain very relevant all the way on into the late game, and knowing which those are and when to use them will be very helpful for every character. I've divided these into 5 tiers, and these are just going to be the basic tiers that I use in most of my tier lists. In S tier, these are very powerful and you'll use them all the time. In A tier, they're quite useful and generally speaking very good. In B tier, they have a relatively marginal effect, but are going to be ones that you will use occasionally. In C tier are grenades that have very minimal effects or easily duplicated effects, so you likely won't need to stockpile those at all. And then in D tier are grenades that have almost no effect, so there's basically no point in picking these up, or their effect is sort of strictly dominated by another option, so there's not much point to these. There are no grenades that are actively harmful to you, so there's no F tier, and there's no grenades, in my opinion, that completely break game balance, so there's no S plus tier for this tier list, but overall the tiers should be fairly self-explanatory. Alright, without any further ado, let's rate some grenades. First up, the Acid Vial. So the Acid Vial is an relatively early game focused item. It's going to lose effectiveness over the course of the game, so I'm going to be evaluating these early game focused grenades in the context of the early game, where they are likely to come up, because that's when you're most likely to actually use them. In the later game, this will not be as relevant, of course, just because the numbers don't keep up over the course of the game, but I think it's worth looking at how they perform during the point in the game when you're likely to have them and use them regularly. The Acid Vial does 2d6 acid damage with a dexterity saving throw to negate the damage completely. So an enemy who succeeds on the saving throw takes no damage at all. And the saving throw is a DC 13, and that's a fixed difficulty class. Almost all of the grenades use fixed difficulty classes rather than using your character's difficulty class, so as the game progresses, the save DC on these will fall pretty far behind compared to what it would be if it used your character's actual spell save DC. This also will not be improved by items that increase your save DCs, so for the most part you are stuck with exactly the DC that you get. DC 13 is pretty easy to pass for most enemies. In the very early game, that's a relatively high DC, because most characters are going to have +3 from their... that's going to be basically the same as most spellcasters' DC at level 1, with base 8 +2 from your proficiency and +3 from your stats. Most of your spells will also have a DC 13, but dexterity is a pretty bad save to target in the early game because so many of the enemies you're facing are goblins who have excellent dexterity saves, and remains a bad save to target throughout the entire game because it's the Generally speaking, Dexterity is the second worst save to target after Constitution, because enemies will tend to have very high numbers in it. The Acid Vial, therefore, is unlikely to do damage under most circumstances, but what it does do is create an acid surface on the ground, and enemies standing inside the acid surface suffer a -2 penalty to their armor class. There's no saving throw against this effect, so even if you sort of discount the amount of damage that this is doing, because it's very unlikely to do damage, a fairly large AoE, this is a 7-foot radius AoE surface that reduces enemy armor class by 2, is a pretty significant bonus. Reducing enemy armor class by 2 is a not inconsiderable penalty to inflict without a saving throw, so acid vials can actually be used to make it much more likely for you to land attacks. Now, how often is this going to be better than just making another attack? The answer is not that often, but there will be times where you have one character who's unlikely to do damage and another character who does a lot of damage but really needs to hit, and the acid vial can help those out. In particular, if you have a character who's using Sharpshooter or Great Weapon Master, and then a spellcaster who's like out of spells, or you don't want to spend resources in the fight, having the spellcaster throw an acid vial can make it much more likely that your Sharpshooter or Great Weapon Master characters land their attacks. The low damage and inconsistency of the damage definitely counts against this, but mostly it's for the acid surface. Acid surfaces you can get from a level 1 spell if you have a level 1 spell slot available, but replacing a level 1 spell is not a terrible use for a grenade. I'm going to put this in B tier. I think that it is unlikely to come up that often, but when it does, it being able to reduce enemy armor class by 2 with no saving throw for just an attack action is not irrelevant, so it will come up sometimes. B tier for the Acid Vial. Alchemist's Fire. Another fairly early game focused grenade. This one sets enemies on fire, and it inflicts the burning condition, and also creates a fairly large AoE burning surface on the ground. 10-foot radius for a burning surface is pretty big. That's going to be a fairly large burning surface. And importantly, this has no saving throws associated with it at all. An enemy in the AoE will always get the burning effect, which does 1d4 damage, and they'll always take 1d4 fire damage for entering the AoE of the fire, because it creates a fire surface under them, so they take 1d4 damage. So they're going to take 2d4 fire damage with no saves at all, and then possibly more if they continue to burn on subsequent turns, or if they walk over the fire surface, which enemies are very likely to do. Usually you'll get like 3d4 fire out of this, which is not a terrible use of an action in the very early game, and sometimes more if you can have enemies continuously walk over the fire surface or pull them over it with Thorn Whip or something along those lines. Alchemist Fire therefore fills the niche of just killing low health enemies with guaranteed damage, as well as putting reasonable AoE damage on ignorable enemies. This is especially useful in a bunch of goblin fights where there are enemies with like 10 to 15 HP, and the 2d4 fire damage is very likely when combined with any other AoE effect to bring them to 0 immediately, or just deal decent damage over the course of long fights. Alchemist Fire, I think, also replaces a lot of other spells that would do a similar thing. Something like Burning Hands is an AoE damage option at low levels. If enemies pass the save on that, they take 3d6 halved, which is an average of 5-ish damage. Well, you do 5 damage without a save at all with the Alchemist's Fire, so you can use this to replace a spell like Burning Hands and take better spells on your characters. Overall, the Alchemist's Fire is going to come up pretty regularly. Anything that doesn't have a save associated with it is always going to be pretty good, and in the early game, Alchemist's Fire is going to be a pretty nice option for your characters, so I'm going to put it in A tier. Obviously, this loses a lot of value over the course of the game, but the ability to just do great damage in the early game, better damage than often a weapon action will do, as well as kill enemies with no chance of missing if they have low health, is very valuable in the early game. So the Alchemist Fire is going to win you like 1 or 2 fights in the early game. That's worth it for carrying grenades. A tier. The Caustic Bulb. So the Caustic Bulb creates a caustic brine surface. It's the only thing in the game that makes that surface, and it does so in a 10-foot radius AoE, so the same as the Acid Vial, or so the same as the Alchemist Fire, but slightly larger than the Acid Vial. The Caustic Brine surface does 1d4 damage per turn to things inside of it, so it's exactly the same as the fire damage surface, but it doesn't inflict the burning damage. Caustic Bulb is basically strictly worse than Alchemist's Fire because it won't set enemies on fire, so it won't continue to damage them after they leave the surface, and it doesn't do the 2d4 initial damage that you get from Alchemist's Fire, so it will only deal 1d4, so while it is still no save damage, it's significantly less than the most common grenade in the game. Alchemist's Fire is both very common and very craftable, so it is relatively easy to replace Caustic Bulbs with Alchemist Fire completely. You might use this on the Nautiloid, because you can pick them up on the Nautiloid. They might come up then, but after the Nautiloid, you're just going to replace these with Alchemist Fire completely. No save damage is still always slightly interesting, just anything that does damage with no save at all, and that does guaranteed damage is always slightly interesting, so I'm going to put it in C tier, but for the most part this is just a strictly worse version of Alchemist's Fire, and there's no reason to carry these when you can carry Alchemist Fire instead. The Grease Bottle. So, a bottle of grease, when thrown, creates a 10-foot radius AoE grease spell. Exactly the same as the spell. It creates a grease surface on the ground, which causes enemies to make a dexterity saving throw or fall over. When used from the bottle, the save DC is fixed at 12, which, like I talked about, you will probably start with a DC of at least 13 on your spell. So it's going to be a lower DC than actually casting the grease spell. The grease spell, I think, though, is a very powerful effect. Knocking enemies prone in Baldur's Gate is incredibly powerful. They have to make this save when they're initially hit by the grease bottle, and then if they try to move on the surface subsequently on their turn. And if they fail the save on their turn, they fall prone and lose the rest of their turn. So it can, for a consumable, has a decent chance of stunning enemies. The low save DC means that enemies won't fail that often, but it only takes one enemy to fall prone for the grease bottle to have traded your action for an enemy action, which is often a good trade, and it has the ceiling on this is much higher than that. If you can hit, say, 5 enemies with it and 3 of them fall prone, you've cost 3 enemies their actions, which is awesome. The grease surface is also flammable, so you could combine this with fire damage that you do, or casting it on an existing torch to make enemies roll against the saving throw initially and then also catch fire, so you can duplicate half of the Alchemist's Fire effect, or basically the entirety of the Caustic Bulb's effect, just by casting this on an existing source of fire, by throwing it at a torch or something, or by hitting it with fire damage afterwards. I would say that being flammable for the grease spell and for the grease bottle is mostly a downside. You would rather not set it on fire in most circumstances, because you'd rather have the guaranteed slowed enemy movement speed with difficult terrain and the chance of them falling prone and losing their turn. But it is still a pretty powerful effect to be able to set it on fire, and for the grease bottle, it's less of an opportunity cost because they're less likely to fall prone. So guaranteed damage is still just always useful in every circumstance, so it's very good. This is good both coming and going, therefore, because it's got a powerful effect that duplicates a very good spell at the cost of a consumable, which is a great resource trade, and has the option to be turned into guaranteed damage if an enemy has 2 hit points and you just need to finish them off without the chance of missing. Grease Bottle, therefore, is, I think, just an excellent consumable, very good in the early game. Will, of course, lose relevancy in the late game, like most of these early game-focused grenades, but is just a very powerful option to have in the early game and can help you through a lot of early game fights much more smoothly. I'm going to put it also in A tier. The Hearthlight Bomb. So the Hearthlight Bomb basically casts Dancing Lights. It's exactly the same as the cantrip. So it duplicates a cantrip, but it does duplicate a cantrip that normally takes concentration. Dancing Lights creates a 30-foot radius area of light as the Hearthlight Bomb, but when you cast Dancing Lights with your character, it uses your concentration, preventing you from concentrating on anything else during the fight, whereas the Hearthlight Bomb doesn't take your concentration. Now, is that good? I'd say it's still not particularly useful, because Dancing Lights is generally a quite marginal effect. Most parties are going to have better sources of light and just more reliable sources of light through the light spell. You can throw a torch for a very similar effect effect, and you should be carrying torches in general. So if you need to light an area, you can throw a torch or set something on fire, and generally speaking, that's going to be a better way to create lighting effects in the game than the Hearthlight Bomb. But the Hearthlight Bomb does have some applications, especially in Act 2, where you might want to light a very large area. Generally speaking, I think you're going to be better off just having the light cantrip somewhere in your party, but if you don't have the light cantrip and don't have dark vision, need to light a large area, the Hearthlight Bomb will come up. In my opinion, I think that this is just not really worth carrying. I think that the marginal impact of having this available is very low compared to just having a cantrip that produces light somewhere in your party, or just carrying torches that you can drop on the ground or throw or whatever. And so I wouldn't recommend the Hearthlight Bomb. I think it's probably not worth the wait and opportunity cost of not selling it, and I definitely wouldn't recommend spending alchemy ingredients crafting it. So I'm going to put the Hearthlight Bomb in D tier. I think the effect is just too marginal. You know, it's not completely useless. You might use it very, very occasionally, but it just doesn't do much that you won't have better sources of elsewhere, and I just don't think it's worth the mental effort of remembering you have this as a consumable, or the carry weight or alchemy ingredients or whatever of carrying it around. So D tier. Holy Water. So a flask of holy water can be thrown to deal 3d6 radiant damage in a 7-foot radius AoE, so a fairly small AoE, but enough to relatively reliably hit 2 enemies with it. And it does 3d6 radiant damage with a dexterity save for half to fiends or undead. It only works on fiends or undead in terms of the damage output, and the dex save is DC 13, so many enemies are going to pass that. Though undead, it must be noted, many undead have relatively weak dexterity saves, so you will more often land the full damage than you would otherwise. A dex save for half, notably, isn't a dex save for 0. So this does do guaranteed damage to fiends or undead, and if they are very low health, then you can drop them to 0 with this as a result. However, by the time you're regularly fighting fiends and undead in like Act 2 or late Act 1, Holy Water's damage has just been massively outpaced. You're going to be like level 6 or 7 by the time you're regularly fighting enemies that this is useful against, and by that point you have Spirit Guardians, you have way better options, your cantrip actions are just going to do more damage than the Holy Water will do, and so generally speaking, I just don't think this is ever going to be that useful against the enemies that it targets, because they just don't show up until late enough in the game that you just won't have, that you'll just have way better options than spending an attack action throwing Holy Water. Notably, it also does create a water surface, which doesn't but it doesn't get enemies who are struck by it wet, unlike throwing water. So you can use it to inflict the wet condition with alongside fire damage. If you create a water surface and then hit it to create a steam cloud, you can use it to make the wet condition. You can also use it to create an ice surface alongside cold damage, or an acid surface alongside acid damage. So there's a few options, because water surfaces are generally fairly powerful there, but the damage is very marginal, and there's better ways to get water surfaces also at this stage of the game. So generally speaking, I don't think you're going to use Holy Water that frequently. I don't want to rate any source of guaranteed damage below C tier, just because sometimes an enemy will be at 3 hit points and you can throw Holy Water at them to finish them off without spending a spell slot. But by this point in the game, it is very likely that you will just have better options every turn of combat, so you really won't be losing that much if you ignore Holy Water, but C tier I think is reasonable for it. The Oil Flask. So the Oil Flask is not craftable, it's a findable item, and it's only available starting in Act 3. So given that it shows up pretty late in the game, you'd think it would have a relatively powerful effect compared to the more early game focused grenades that we've talked about so far. But it doesn't. It creates an oil surface, which is a surface that has no effect on its own. It doesn't do anything on its own. The only thing that it does is it can catch fire. So it creates a 10-foot radius flammable surface. Well, 10-foot radius of fire, that sure sounds awfully familiar to me. That is exactly the same as what Alchemist fire does without having to be combined with more fire. So the oil flask is completely useless. There's just no circumstance where you would want the oil flask over Alchemist's fire or grease if you want a surface that if for some reason you want to create a surface that you intend to set fire later, like, I don't know, maybe you're setting an ambush for an enemy, but this is just a strictly worse version of those two grenades, which are available very early, so D tier for the oil flask. Next up, the Scrap and Shrapnel grenade, and also the Spiked Bulb. I'm going to talk about these two together because they are what in like Magic the Gathering you would call a functional reprint. They do exactly the same thing but have different names. And what they do is that they have a 13-foot radius, 13-foot radius AoE that deals 1 piercing damage and inflicts bleeding for 1 turn. Bleeding deals 2 damage at the beginning of the character's turn, and gives them disadvantage on con saves. So notably, there's no saving throw on this, so it's guaranteed exactly 3 damage, which is not an amazing amount of guaranteed damage, but again, guaranteed damage always has its place. And it is no save to inflict disadvantage on a Constitution saving throw. Some Constitution saving throw targeting effects are devastating, and so giving enemies no save disadvantage on those effects to set up an ally who can cast a concentration con save targeting spell, like Stinking Cloud or something like that can just completely ruin an enemy's day, is a pretty powerful use for a grenade. The AoE is massive also, which is not irrelevant. It is exactly the same AoE as a fireball, so this grenade hits a very large radius, does 3 damage to a bunch of enemies. So if there's a lot of enemies on the field, this would be like a 15 damage action, which is, in the early game, a totally reasonable amount of damage for an action. It's spread out, so it's not as good as 15 damage to a single enemy, but there will be times where this does reasonable damage in exchange for your action, and the Constitution save disadvantage will remain relevant on into the late game. Bleeding also has some synergy with certain character abilities or items or stuff, so there are some times where you want to inflict bleeding on a whole bunch of enemies. Again, these are all minor synergies, but it doesn't take that much for a grenade that has like a bunch of minor synergies to be worth using. I think that these are relatively easy to forget, and if you forget them, honestly, it won't be a massive penalty to your character or anything like that. But if you have a character that is likely to be casting con save targeting spells, or if you have synergy with bleed in your party, or if you just need to deal a decent amount of damage in the early game, the spiked bulbs that you can get right from the beginning of the game will be pretty valuable. And so these two grenades do definitely have their place. I'm going to place them in B tier because I think you won't use them that regularly, and I'm going to be completely honest, if you forget these exist, it's not going to hurt your game that much, but they do have a relatively powerful effect with no saving throw associated with it, so which is always something that is worth paying attention to, especially when it's in an AoE, and this really helps set up your spellcasters or just kill enemies who are at exactly 3 hit points, though the likelihood of multiple enemies being that low isn't that high. If you need guaranteed damage, generally speaking, you're better off with the Alchemist's fire, but, you know, these have multiple effects, so they're worth carrying. The Smokepowder Bomb. So you can't craft the Smokepowder Bomb, but it's available to purchase from merchants very early in the game. In quite early Act 1, you can start buying and stockpiling Smokepowder Bombs. And it deals 3d4 plus 9 force damage with a dexterity saving throw for half in a 13-foot radius AoE. So again, exactly the same AoE as a fireball. 3d4 plus 9 is a very reliable amount of damage, because d4s tend to be quite reliable, right? There's a relatively small range that a d4 can roll. In fact, the range is 4. So you're going to be dealing 16.5 damage on average with this, but it's very likely to roll very close to that 16.5. So you can you will always deal at least 12 damage with it, and you will pretty reliably deal between 15 and 18 damage with it. So you can rely on this to deal quite good damage. 16.5 damage is notably just about slightly over half of a fireball, so you're effectively buying half a fireball as a consumable, and you can get this very early in the game, much before you would be able to get a fireball. The amount of damage that it does is more than a first level AoE spell and more than most second level AoE spells available as a consumable and thrown with an attack action and so on in a much larger radius than first and second level spells. So this is a better action than those spells and can definitely help you win fights against lots of weak enemies, which of course in Act 1 a lot of fights are against lots of weak enemies because you're going to be fighting the Goblin Camp, you're going to be fighting the Gnolls and so on. The Smokepowder Bomb therefore is just an excellent item that wildly outpaces AoE damage available at the very early stages in the game and remains relevant on into the late game. It's also force damage, which is pretty useful because force damage is a damage type that almost nothing resists and has some enemies are vulnerable to force damage. The dexterity save is only DC 13, so it is very likely that enemies are going to take half damage from it, but even with the capped dexterity save, the amount of damage that this does is going to be quite significant. 16.5 halved to 8.25 is still just a pretty reasonable amount of damage in an AoE. It's quite easy to get a 40 damage turn out of throwing a Smokepowder Bomb in the early game, and almost nothing gives you a 40 damage turn in the early game, so the Smokepowder Bomb is excellent. It's also worth noting that if you don't mind cheesing it, the Smokepowder Bomb is quite buggy. It detonates when you deal damage to it, and it can repeat. The same Smokepowder Bomb can repeatedly detonate if you deal multiple instances of damage to it with the same effect. So if you stack effects, stack things that have damage riders associated with them, like lightning charges or hunter's mark or whatever, and then throw a Smokepowder Bomb, you will get multiply detonating Smokepowder Bombs as of the current patch, as of the time of recording. So if you have lightning charges on your character and you throw a bomb, you double the damage that the bomb does. If you hunter's mark an enemy and hit them with a bomb, you double the damage that that bomb does, in addition to dealing the hunter's mark damage, and so on. So the Smokepowder Bomb you can cheese. You can also stack a lot of them into a container, blow them all up for a really big bomb, which is something that you can do with a lot of these grenades, but the Smokepowder Bomb being force damage and doing relatively high damage in AoE is a very powerful use of that effect, so you can drop them all around enemies, they'll set each other off for overlapping damage, and you can cheese enemies out using that. For that reason, for the reason of even its intended use is very good, and it has some buggy and abusive use cases, but also just it's one of the highest damaging possible things you can do for the first like 5 levels of the game. I'm going to put the Smokepowder Bomb in S tier. I think that you really should pay attention to these and stockpile them in the early game because they'll get you through a lot of the more difficult early game fights basically for free. If you just throw a volley of these to start off a bunch of fights, you'll kill all the weak enemies in that fight very easily thanks to the very large AoE. The Void Bulb. So this is found in the very early game and then sold by some merchants in Act 1. So it's relatively easy to get a stockpile of these, but you can't craft them via alchemy, you do have to buy them from merchants. The Void Bulb does 1 force damage, precisely 1 force damage, in a 20-foot radius, and pulls enemies struck by it, or creatures struck by it, towards the center with a strength saving throw to avoid the pull. 1 force damage is technically guaranteed damage, but the likelihood of an enemy being at exactly 1 hit point, so it being worth throwing a Void Bulb to try to actually kill them, is very low, and of course 1 damage as the lowest possible amount of damage that you can do is not going to be meaningfully impactful in most fights. If you hit like 5 enemies with this, it's still only a 5 damage action, so we're not looking at the damage. Pulling enemies towards a central point, though, is a very powerful effect. You can group enemies for AoE spells, you can group them for attacks like a Tiger Barbarian Swing or a Swords Bard Flourish or something like that, and you can also use this with clever positioning to pull enemies off of high ground and stuff like that. You do have to place it pretty specifically, and they can't be too high up to use it, so it's not quite as good as other pull effects like that, but repositioning enemies is very, very powerful. Now, normally at this point I would say, but it doesn't work because the save DC is very low on all of these grenades, except that the Void Bulb has a save DC of 18 to negate. So for most early game enemies, a strength save of 18 is very difficult to achieve, even though strength is a relatively bad saving throw to target, because a lot of enemies will have very high strength. A lot of enemies will have very low strength as well. Enemy casters or archers may have quite low strength saves, and so DC 18 will, for many enemies, remain quite difficult to succeed on, even on into the very late game. So you can use this to fairly reliably pull enemies together and group them up for an AoE. The 1 force damage is basically irrelevant, but grouping enemies for an AoE is really nice and remains very powerful on into the late game. The Black Hole Illithid power is very similar to this and is a very good Illithid power, although usable as a bonus action with the appropriate story event, so that obviously makes it a little bit stronger. But the Void Bulb ability to reposition enemies is very strong. Repositioning enemies is something that is difficult to do and very, very powerful in Dungeons & Dragons. So the Void Bulb allowing you to do that in an AoE, pull enemies together in order to hit them with smaller area of effect attacks, and the fact that it covers a 20-foot radius, so it will very reliably hit every enemy in an encounter, is quite good. I think that the likelihood of using this is not... You're not going to use this like every combat or anything, and it usually won't win a combat on its own, but it's definitely one to keep in mind in order to land powerful AoE effects. Things like Destructive Wave or whatever in the older game benefit a lot from carrying Void Bulbs, and things like Hunter Volley. A lot of parties are going to get a reasonable use out of Void Bulbs, and I do recommend carrying them. I'm going to put them in A tier. I don't think they quite crack S tier, because they are relatively situational, but the effect is so powerful that they're definitely worth paying attention to. Water. So this is available in a lot of forms in the game. There's water, there's bottles of water, there's barrels of water, there's all kinds of different sources of thrown water, and the game doesn't really classify these as grenades. It classifies them as miscellaneous items, but you're going to use these bottles of water as grenades in practice, so I think they're definitely worth covering in this tier list. When thrown, a bottle of water creates a 7-foot radius, so relatively small, area of a water surface, and also gets enemies within that water surface wet, puts out fires on anything in that surface as well. A water surface is very powerful because you can use it to create other surfaces. When hit with fire damage, it makes a steam cloud. When hit with acid, it turns into an acid surface. When hit with electricity, it makes a damaging surface. And very importantly, when hit with cold, it turns into an ice surface, which can cause enemies to fall prone and is very powerful. Notably, all these surfaces, if you create them with a character's spell effect or attack, will use that character's save DC. So unlike like the grease bottle, which uses a fixed DC, water that you then freeze will use your character's save DC and knock over enemies. The other advantage of throwing water at enemies is it gets them wet, and wet is an extremely powerful condition in Baldur's Gate 3. It massively increases damage that you're going to do with lightning and cold, and in combination with the fact that this also creates a water surface means that cold damage will both be doubled when you hit a wet enemy with it, and create an ice surface, because you'll hit the enemy who's standing on the water surface, which will create an ice surface and will then knock them over. Thrown water, therefore, is a very, very powerful tool, and one that every party should absolutely investigate. Wet is one of the most powerful conditions in Baldur's Gate 3, because damage vulnerabilities are very powerful, and something that the game, that Dungeons & Dragons typically avoids giving to parties. Vulnerability doubling damage just makes that damage way out of scale with the intended amount of damage that the characters are supposed to do with those spells. And so the ability of water to double the damage of any lightning or cold damage that you're doing is massive. It also, when you get an ally wet, makes them resistant to fire damage and prevents them from burning, as well as dousing any existing burning effects that they have on them. And there's a lot of fire damage in the game. Resistant to fire damage is a very powerful condition that you can inflict by just throwing water at your party. So this has both offensive and defensive uses, as well as a bunch of story uses. The amount of things that you can do with thrown water is absurd, and you will find not only tons of creative uses, but just a level 1 use of throwing it at enemies and then hitting them with lightning so they die immediately is just so brokenly powerful that there's no way that a bottle of water wouldn't be an S-tier grenade. I know that this might sound odd, because this, obviously, it's a very humble item, the bottle of water, but keeping these around is critically important to most parties in Baldur's Gate. You will gain massive benefits from having water. Every character should carry a stack of these because it will come up turn after turn after turn in combat that the best thing you could do is throw a bottle of water. S tier, absolutely. The Web Grenade. So Web Grenade creates a surface that is exactly the same as the level 2 spell, Web. So it will be difficult terrain, prevent falling damage, which isn't irrelevant. There are some times where you want to jump your whole party down from a ledge, and the Web Grenade can help out there, though obviously you can duplicate that with Fairy Fire. And in that surface, which is a 10-foot radius AoE, it is difficult terrain, flammable, and creatures moving inside it have to pass a DC 12 dexterity save or become enwebbed. Enwebbed means they can't move, attack rolls against them have advantage, and their attack rolls and dex saves have disadvantage. So that's pretty powerful overall. Obviously, that's a very strong effect. It's a slightly better condition than prone in general, enwebbed. And will shut down melee enemies similarly, but for the most part the Web Grenade plays out very similarly to the Grease Bottle. It has a low save DC, but relatively debilitating condition, so you might get one decent hit off that condition, and it creates difficult terrain, but it's flammable, so you have to be careful where you place it. You can use it for a little bit of extra damage. Overall, I would say it works almost exactly the same in practice as the Grease Bottle. You might get one decent effect out of it, which is good enough. If you trade your action for an enemy action, that's usually a pretty good use of a grenade, and it creates difficult terrain, flammable surface for some guaranteed damage, and so on. So Web Grenade plays out identically to Grease Bottle and is A tier similarly as a result. The Fungal Bamboozler. So the Fungal Bamboozler creates a Timask Spores area in a 7-foot radius AoE, so relatively easy to hit 2 enemies with, fairly difficult to hit more than 2 with in most circumstances. And inside that area, which lasts for 3 turns, creatures have to make a DC 10 Constitution save or become befuddled. Befuddle is like a better version of the level 4 spell Confusion. It causes them to just skip their turn and wander around randomly, so they won't do anything on their turn. So it's effectively a stun, but with a DC 10 save. Now, a stun on a grenade is pretty good, but a DC 10 Constitution save is just never going to succeed. Enemies will pass that save very easily all of the time, although it has to be noted that the Fungal Bamboozler can be combined with the bleeding effect from Scrap and Shrapnel Grenade to make it slightly more reliable. DC 10 with disadvantage still isn't going to be something enemies fail that often, but is much more likely to be failed. So if you combine those 2 grenades together, they get better. Whether that's worth 2 actions, I think is relatively unlikely to be worth 2 actions, but if you can keep enemies stuck inside of it, maybe using even more grenades like Grease or Web or other effects that lock enemies in place, a DC 10 save with disadvantage every turn for 3 turns, or they just lose, or they just get stunned, is not a horrible condition. I think that this just requires way too much setup because the save DC is just so low. So I'm not going to place it in D tier because it's such a powerful effect that it is worth trying to set up. But I think that this is another one that is just so marginal, I'm going to put it in C tier. I think it's unlikely to come up unless you do a lot of work to make it happen. If you do that work, it's worth it. But even if you do that work, it is not very reliable. So this is more a for fun grenade than one that's very good. I'm going to put it in C tier because I think it can be used, but generally speaking, won't be. The Haste Spore Grenade. Well, it has one of my favorite words in the name, so let's see if it lives up to it. The Haste Spore Grenade creates a Haste Spores area for 3 turns, which is a cloud that is flammable, so you can blow this up, of haste spores. Creatures that move into the haste spores cloud within those 3 turns get 1 turn of the haste spores effect, which is identical to the haste spell, increasing your movement speed by 30 feet, giving you +2 armor class, and giving you an additional action each turn. Now, it only lasts 1 turn, so you only get 1 additional action, but if you stay or move back into the haste spores effect, you can refresh it for following turns. And notably, the Haste Spore Grenades effect, the Haste Spores effect, doesn't come with lethargy at the end of the effect. So creatures who are in the Haste Spores effect for 3 turns get 3 turns of haste with no downsides. It's like a potion of speed, but even better because it doesn't have any downsides, and is an AoE effect that you can apply to your whole party. This obviously is ridiculously powerful. I don't have to talk too much about how good haste is. Obviously, haste is an insanely strong effect. Haste without the downsides is even better, and AoE haste that just takes an attack action to cast is nonsensically powerful. This is just an extremely powerful ability that will serve you very well throughout the game. It doesn't stack with other sources of haste, so it won't stack with speed potions, won't stack with the haste spell, but does just give you the haste effect, and it does stack with Terrazol, which we talked about in the potions tier list, so do keep that in mind if you want even more sources of haste. Haste Spores is broken and just very powerful. 3 turns of haste for your whole party is awesome. In exchange for a grenade, it's immediately action neutral because you can drop it at your own feet and get the haste spores action right away, which lets your characters just act immediately, of course, with the second action. So you never actually spend an action on using this, even if you use it in combat. And of course, you can throw it before combat starts and set up your whole party in it just for 2 turns of haste at the beginning of combat, provided you stay in the haste spores area. Obviously, insanely powerful. Haste is really, really good. No need to talk too much more about this, but Haste Spore Grenade is, of course, an S-tier option. The Haste Spore Flask. So this is a unique version of the Haste Spore Grenade, and while I'm normally not covering unique grenades, I wanted to cover this one because it's the same thing as the Haste Spore Grenade, but given as a quest reward, but has one weird difference that actually makes it significantly, makes it somewhat different in practice compared to the Haste Spore Grenade, and something that you should pay attention to and just know the difference between these 2 items. The Haste Spore Flask creates exactly the same effect, but in a 10-foot radius instead of a 7-foot radius, and the cloud that it creates lasts forever. It's not limited to 3 turns, so if a fight is going to go really long for whatever reason, you can use the Haste Spore Flask to make a much longer lasting and larger radius AoE of haste spores, which can give you the effect just much more often. Just something that's worth mentioning about the differences between these items, because it is kind of neat that there is one that lasts forever if you know that you're going to need more than 3 turns worth of haste. That's unlikely in most encounters, but the Haste Spore Flask is worth hanging on to because it is so powerful. It's just even more powerful than the most powerful grenade in the game already, so S tier, of course, for this one as well. The Noxious Spore Grenade. So this creates a cloud of noxious fumes with a 7-foot radius that deal 1d4 poison damage per turn to creatures inside of them, and then 2d4 additional poison damage, but with a con save to negate that additional poison damage. Now, weirdly, unlike every other grenade in the game, this one uses your item save DC rather than having a fixed DC. So this will actually use the save DC, the spell save DC of your characters, but with your item save DC, so using the weird rules that Baldur's Gate uses to calculate that. That mostly won't make a huge difference, but it does mean that you will probably, enemies will probably fail the saving throw on the extra 2d4 poison damage with relative frequency, so it will deal a little bit more damage than you might think given the averages on these other grenades, but still even if it does 3d4 damage per turn, a 3d4 damage per turn cloud is just not that valuable, and 1d4 damage per turn is obviously not great. It's also explosive, so you can turn it into burning ground if you hit it with fire damage, which is bad because that's going to decrease the amount of damage that it does in most circumstances, so that's basically a strict downside, the fact that you can accidentally burn away your own Noxious Spore Grenade clouds. But overall, this item is just a little bit of guaranteed damage, 1d4 damage. It's a little better than Caustic Bulb because it's 1d4 damage all the time, but with the chance of dealing 3d4. The effect is a little better, but the small AoE holds this back, so it's probably in practice going to hit fewer enemies as well than Caustic Bulb. If you're trying to keep an enemy trapped inside of a dangerous effect, then this one is an okay one to try to keep them trapped inside of, but you'd rather use like the Fungal Bamboozler if you're expending resources to keep an enemy trapped in a dangerous effect, then the Fungal Bamboozler is more likely to be worth trying to keep them trapped in than this very small amount of damage. I'm going to put it in C tier. It's a little better than Caustic Bulb in effect, but smaller AoE, so very similar in practice to that item. The Sanguine Explosive. So this is locked behind a story event. You have to make a specific story choice in Act 2, and then another specific story choice in Act 3, and then you'll unlock the ability to purchase these from an Act 3 vendor if you do that. The Sanguine Explosive deals 4d8 force plus 4d8 fire damage, which is more damage than a fireball. It's 36 average damage compared to Fireball's 28 average damage in a 26-foot radius AoE, so twice the radius of a fireball as well. There's no spell that does sort of the equivalent to this, but it's, I would say, basically worth a level 4 spell slot for this explosive that you get as a consumable item, and obviously that's awesome, although the radius is large enough that it's sometimes difficult to avoid hitting an ally with it when you throw it. The damage on this is awesome. It also inflicts burning, and it has a dexterity save to halve the damage and remove the burning, but the dexterity save DC is 17. 17 save DC is pretty high, so even in Act 3, a lot of enemies will fail a DC 17 dex save. Not a ton, but enough will that you'll sometimes get full damage out of this. And even if it's reliably doing half damage, it is still really good damage in a very large AoE, and more damage than you're going to be doing with most attacks in most circumstances. The Sanguine Explosive is great against low dex enemies. It also, it does actually even more average damage against low dex enemies, because it also inflicts burning for an extra d4 damage, plus any additional turns that they live. They continuously take more burning damage. So it is just a huge amount of damage for a single attack action, very reliably hits everyone in an encounter thanks to the massive radius of this explosive. Getting an improved fireball every turn for a consumable item. You can buy up to 2 of these per day, so you can just get basically 2 extra 4th level damage spells every single day when using the Sanguine Explosives. That's a huge amount of damage that you can add to your party basically for free. Anyone can use these, of course, so you don't have to have your spellcaster actually cast your AoE spell if your AoE spell is a Sanguine Explosive. This is a massive amount of damage that wildly increases the late game effectiveness of your party. Definitely worth buying and using these because the AoE is great, the damage output is great, the damage type is good, it's force damage. Half force and half fire is one great damage type and one bad damage type, but still just very good overall. So it's going to be very reliable damage in a giant AoE. Excellent item, S tier explosive for sure. The Flashblinder. So the Flashblinder is available in Act 3, so you can't get it before Act 3, and it is a 20-foot radius AoE that inflicts Blinded with a DC 16 con save to negate. Now that's not in and of itself that amazing. Blinded is a pretty good condition to inflict, but a DC 16 con save by the time you're in Act 3, most enemies are likely to succeed on. Con is typically a very bad saving throw to target because almost all enemies in the game will have at least decent con saves, and they're very likely to have quite high con saves, especially the enemies that you actually want to blind. And there's also lots of no-save sources of blind in the game, so blinding for 2 turns with a grenade is not with a grenade on a relatively easy to succeed saving throw is not a massive effect in and of itself. However, the Flashblinder has an unlisted and extremely powerful effect, which causes Steel Watchers who are hit by it to become stunned. On Tactician mode or below, they stun for 2 turns, and on Honor mode, they're stunned for 1 turn. And even though the stunned effect includes a con save listing in the tooltip, the stun does not have an associated saving throw. Stunning some of the most powerful enemies in the game with no save in a gigantic AoE in exchange for just an attack action is incredibly powerful. Obviously, Steel Watchers are quite dangerous, and being able to stun them with a grenade in an AoE is massive. And it also has a unique effect in the Steel Watcher associated boss fight. I won't spoil the specific mechanics of that boss fight particularly, but Flashblinders are going to be very, very good in that boss fight. On Tactician or below, these just instantly win any fight against Steel Watchers. 2 turns of no save stun is incredible. On Honor mode, it's still just going to be a massive benefit against any Steel Watcher fight that you are engaging in. And so for Act 3, these are going to be extremely helpful all the way through. Now, they're only good against one specific enemy type, but they're so good against that specific enemy type that I'm going to still put them in S tier. You will only use them against Steel Watchers, but since they just instantly win those encounters, they are definitely worth taking, because those are some of the most dangerous Act 3 encounters typically, so having Flashblinders available to instantly solve them means that your party just simply doesn't have to engage with some of the most dangerous encounters in the late game, and is just a very powerful option for every party. No save stuns are good, obviously, and these are no save stuns against very dangerous enemies. S tier item. The Sleeping Potion. So I mentioned this one in my potions tier list as not actually being a potion, really. It's really a grenade, because when you drink it, the only thing that happens is you fall asleep. There's no circumstance I can think of where this would be beneficial, although if you can come up with one, definitely let me know in the comments. I'm always interested in weird interactions like that. But the real use for this potion is to throw it at enemies. When thrown, it creates a 3-foot radius AoE, so a very tiny AoE, very unlikely to hit multiple enemies, so usually you're only hitting a single enemy with this. And enemies in that AoE have to make a DC 11 Constitution save or fall asleep. This is similar to the Fungal Bamboozler in that it's a very low DC con save or get stunned, effectively. But sleeping is worse than bamboozled because the enemies can wake each other up, and you won't hit every enemy in an encounter with this. And because it's a one-shot use, you can't even do the thing where you try to trap enemies inside the AoE the way you can with the Fungal Bamboozler, so you are never going to get any use out of the Sleeping Potion. In my opinion, a DC 11 con save, even if you use things like the Spiked Bulb in order to give enemies disadvantage on it, is just too low to spend an action on. And since it's not something that makes enemies roll over and over again, you're only ever going to hit one enemy with it in most circumstances, you're effectively spending your action for a 30% chance of stunning an enemy, which is a very inefficient use of an action, and they can easily be woken up by their allies as well, and the AI will prioritize waking them up using only a bonus action. The Sleep Potion, I think, is just not worth using and should instead be sold for money. D tier grenade, don't bother with the Sleeping Potion. Alright, my friends, hope that you have enjoyed this look at all of the grenades. I'm honestly surprised by how highly I rated these. I was not expecting this many grenades to be S or A tier, but I think that actually when you sort of look at them and think about them all and how they relate to the game, especially the early game, you'll see that a lot of them are very useful in the early game, and many of them remain useful all the way through the game. So grenades are something I definitely wouldn't overlook. I also think that of all of the consumables that we've talked about so far, with the possible exception of the Haste Spore grenade, the grenades are the best balanced and most interesting because they add interesting tactical options, but mostly aren't going to just break the encounters the way that elixirs or the really good elixirs or really good potions will. So I think that grenades actually from a design sense also did extremely well in this tier list. They're my favorite consumables that that we rated so far, and I think they're very fun to use as well. Obviously, there's still some abuses where you can stack like a bunch of them, blow them all up at once to one-shot enemies, but used actually as just normal actions in combat, I think grenades are both extremely useful and extremely fun, and I hope that you found this useful to hopefully inspire you to use them more often. Alright, my friends, hope you've enjoyed the video, and of course, if you have, as always, please feel free to leave a comment and like the video. Both of those things help me out a ton with the algorithm. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 guides and other strategy game content. As you can probably guess, we'll be back rating the remaining sets of consumables. There's at least 2 more kinds, so look forward to more tier lists there and more build guides as well. And I will catch you next time. Cheers, folks, and thanks for watching.